Have you ever been told that speaking in tongues is not for today? Maybe you've heard people speak in tongues and it seemed weird. You thought to yourself, this is too strange to be God. Or maybe you believe that people can still speak in tongues today, but that it's not for everybody. Whether you're skeptical or intrigued, whether you speak in tongues or don't, my new book, 9 Lies People Believe About Speaking in Tongues, is the book for you. Get your copy wherever Christian books are sold and head over to stevebremner.com and click on the first link on the homepage for more information about how you can spread the word. Enjoy the show.
Dropping some knowledge and a little love. This is the Fire on Your Head podcast with your host, Steve Bremner. Steve Bremner, missionary to Peru and blogger at stevebremner.com. The podcast where we tackle gray areas your pastor doesn't talk about. Ladies and gentlemen, Steve Bremner.
Blah, blah, blah.
Say, hola, Dr. Brown. Without burping. Say, hola, Dr. Brown.
I love it.
Yeah, something like that. Otra vez.
Hola, bebé.
No, not baby.
Hola, bebé.
Okay. Say, ciao.
Ciao. Ready?
Greetings and welcome to Fire on Your Head. I'm Steve Bremner and I'm the host of this show. It's a podcast designed to kick you out of the upper room and spread the fire. We had a guest a few weeks ago who said there's a time and a place for seeking God in the upper room, staying there, soaking and stuff like that. But there's also a place to get out. And this podcast usually is for that end. I've been doing this show for a while now, but today's guest is, well, arguably our highest profile guest, our biggest get yet. And because he offered to share this interview on social media, I already know that means I have more of you first-time guests checking us out for the first time than I do regular subscribers. Okay, Steve, no pressure. So shortly we're going to get down to the interview I did with Dr. Michael Brown, but we recorded this interview a few days before the Easter weekend. And I was thinking of how, statistically speaking, more people show up at churches on Christmas and Easter than normal. And so some churches might do things differently than normal because of having so many irregular guests. I mean, guests who don't show up regularly. I don't mean guests who are irregular. Or I suppose if you're irregular, we can pray for you for healing over your bowel. Don't worry. So anyway, there was that temptation for me to do that same kind of thing with this particular interview, cater to all the newbies who might be checking this out. But I'm going to do my best to proceed like normal. After the interview, which is about an hour, I've got some listener feedback about the last episode of the podcast. But with regard to this show, I approached Dr. Brown several months ago through email asking if he would be willing to let me interview him about writing. He's got a lot of other books and sermons he's given about various topics, like the homosexual activism agenda stuff, revival in America, hyper grace, personal holiness. He's also got that multiple part series, Answering Jewish Objections to Jesus. I mean, he's just a really prolific writer and academic author. We could have talked to him about any number of topics that he's well versed in, but I wanted to cover something I'm not sure a lot of other people have ever interviewed him about. If I'm not the first one that I can find on the internet that's interviewed him about writing books, forgive me, but I Googled, I looked, I couldn't find anything, and I approached him that way and said, I think there's a lot of people who would like to ask you some questions if they were in my shoes, who would love to know your writing habits, your lifestyle habits that foster your writing, where inspiration comes from, your experiences with publishers, all these kinds of things. So I wanted to cover an interview that he's never done before, if possible. Whenever I reach out to people who are, a bit higher profile than I'm used to having on the podcast, I try to approach it in a way that they may not normally do, so that they may share it on social media, for example, and that their followers don't feel that this is just another run-of-the-mill interview. In fact, I've sent some guests before questions saying, what would you like me to ask you? Are there questions you would love to be asked that you don't normally have thrown your way? So if you're a subscriber to this podcast or a longtime listener of the show, then you've heard me refer to today's guest on many occasions, sometimes as a point of reference, usually when talking about certain topics. And for those of you who don't know who he is, he's a national radio show host, author of a bazillion books, and we're going to talk about that today. He was also one of the leaders of the Brownsville Revival, which birthed the fire school of ministry that I went to in my early 20s. He's that school's director. I forgot to mention that. So I'm having an interview today with him. Maybe you've even read his articles on Charisma Magazine or Town Hall. There's just so many places that he's a contributor to or a columnist at. In our conversation, I asked him about whether he had thought of recording his own audiobooks or hiring someone to do that for him. And you can hear his thoughts on that in the part of the conversation when we get to it. But if you're like me and you are having a hard time reading all of the Kindle books you collect, it might be worth your while to get a membership with Audible, a sister company to Amazon. I've been hoarding Kindle books on my account with Amazon for a long time now, seldom getting around to them because I've only got the same 24 hours in a day as everybody else does. So the solution has become to listen to audiobooks while doing other things. Because let's face it, it's just awkward to hire somebody to stand outside of your shower and read books out loud to you. And it's not just awkward for them, but you as well. So a membership at audible.com costs $14.99 per month. That's in American dollars. So for those of you in Canada or Australia, that'd be like $20 or $21. And pretty much every title in their library is discounted by about 30% for members. Plus, they throw in a monthly credit, which can get you one free book each month on top of that discount. So that's already a sweet deal, and I've taken advantage of it for like 3 or 4 years now. They sometimes even send members only email deals where certain books are discounted down to like $3 or $4. But the real bonus is that the first month is free. That's right, free. Go to audibletrial.com/fireonyourhead and make sure fire on your head is one word. And when you sign up, you'll get one free credit, which allows you to automatically download whatever book you want. So in other words, the first audiobook is on them, risk-free. If you don't like it and decide to cancel before the trial is over, you can still keep the book you got. So like I was hooked on that offer, that promotion, and I've been an Audible customer or an Audible subscriber or member for almost 4 years now. So make sure to stick around after the interview with Dr. Brown. Here's some listener feedback regarding our last episode, which was with our guest Matthew Robert Payne. We discussed this peculiar thing he does where he charges for prophetic words through his website. I got exponentially more feedback than normal on that one, and mostly good. Well, I mean, the people who listened to it before reacting to the title mostly gave me positive feedback, but also some very thought-provoking, interesting insights. So I take some time to go through that. But right now, I'm going to turn this over to the interview I did with Dr. Brown. It's just over an hour, and I hope you enjoy it. I hope you get something out of it. I hope that this is some kind of catalyst in your life. If you're not even gifted with writing or you don't have a passion for that particular thing, book writing isn't the thing you foresee yourself doing, but there's some other passion. I think you'll get a lot out of this interview anyway. And and especially if you stick around and listen to the whole thing and the way I tie up the listener feedback at the end to the interview I did with Dr. Brown, that I very intentionally and purposely take the time to go through that and tie a thread through all of that with going for it and being obedient to whatever God's called you to do with your gifts, your passions, your talent. Don't bury them in the ground because God's some kind of taskmaster. He's put stuff inside of you to bless people with. And so anyway, I'm not going to ramble on anymore about that. Stick around till the end. There's about 20-25 minutes after the interview. That'll be worth your time as well. But without any further ado, enjoy my interview with Dr. Michael Brown. First of all, thank you for your time this morning, for being able to be on my podcast.
Glad to do it, man.
And
it was worth it to get the greeting from your daughter.
Oh, right. And for those listening, I'll put the clip in this recording of a greeting I got Jamina to make for Dr. Brown. But are you surprised that I've taken this long to ever ask you to be on my podcast by any chance?
Yes and no. On the one hand, it wasn't on my mind a lot. You know, we're each kind of running fast on each track that we're on.
Right.
On the other hand, since you've been doing it so long, and since I'm always here for a grad and part of our family overseas, yeah, maybe slightly. But the first time I thought about it was this moment. Actually.
Right. Well, once I heard from you that you were willing to do it, it dawned on me, why have I never asked you if you would do this before? Like you've agreed to talk about, I have plenty to ask you about writing, about inspiration. I've got questions about how you balance research with inspiration. So I would love to get started where when you first started writing or when you first published a book. So like, how did you get into the habit of writing, or what led to your first book, for example?
Yeah, it's actually an interesting story. When I was newly saved, I wasn't a believer for all that long, and I just got this inspiration to write a paragraph or two on faith. I mean, short paragraph, but I felt, wow, God really gave me this. I remember I showed it to my father, who wasn't interested in what I believed really at that point, except just as a loving father. I showed it to my pastor, and he said, oh, maybe God's calling you to write. And that was a very odd concept, because we didn't talk a lot about Christian books or a call to write or be authors. It was more preachers, preachers and teachers and stuff. And when I was in college, I'd have to write essays for different classes, and I'd often get good responses on my literary abilities and stuff like that. But then as the years went on, I always preached very, very simply. I started preaching when I was 18. So when I was saved less than 2 years, I could always preach a very simple, clear message. But when it came to write, I could write like with fire, with passion for a page, and then it would stop. It would start to get technical. And at this point, I was in college, then grad school. And the more scholarly work I was doing, the more technical my writing would become. And I had this frustration because I would feel a call to write and a burden to write. And when I go to write, there wasn't an outlet. Like I said, one page, and then it would get technical. When it came to writing academic stuff, that was great. I mean, I could write page after page after page, and it would be almost impossible to even understand what I wrote afterwards. It was so technical. And so this went on and off for about 17 years. In other words, I had this burden, this sense to do it, and didn't have the outlet. In the mid-1980s, when my sister-in-law was attending a Bible college and started asking questions about what about this, what about that, and how did that line up with this and that, I started to write her a long letter of explanation, and that long letter turned into a book called Compassionate Father, a Consuming Fire, Who is the God of the Old Testament? But that was much more of a teaching book, a little bit more technical. So I still didn't have that release. I wrote my doctoral dissertation, finished that same year. That was very technical, linguistic study. So it wasn't until 1988, went on a 21-day water fast in preparation for ministry in Israel. That led to an intense purging in my own life, working of the Spirit, where my desperation for God became deeper than ever. Early 89, I just was so broken for a dying world and so agonizing for revival. And that summer, I went away just to seek the Lord for a few days at someone's home when they were out of town. And as I was there, I suddenly got stirred, and it started pouring out of me, page after page. And I had my old laptop then, which would be pretty funny to look at today, in a monochrome, big, heavy laptop with, I think, did it have 10 no, did it have a megabyte? I don't know, whatever, memory. But I started writing, it started pouring out of me, and over a 3-week period, I wrote the book, The End of the American Gospel Enterprise. And then the flow to write has stayed ever since. just burdened, consumed, pouring out of me. The greatest sense of anointing and accomplishment I experience to this day is when the Lord really moves on me to write, and I'm gripped, and I still keep up the academic stuff. That's kind of like climbing a mountain. You just chip a little, get higher, little by little, climb that thing. But the other flows out of inspiration in my heart. And there's been a steady flow to write on different subjects over those years. It's changed in terms of intensity. Sometimes I'm gripped with this revival revolution call. Sometimes I'm gripped to correct error and to write something that's a bit more teaching. It's kind of in between. And now writing articles, that's been 3 to 5 articles a week for the last few years. That's been another thing that's just opened up. But 17 years of some level of frustration and prayer until the floodgates really opened. Well,
coincidentally, that happens to be my next question about inspired content and how you know when something's just going to be an article or something's going to be something that you want to sit down in front of your microphone and talk about on your radio show, or how it's better to take something God's burdening you with and preach it, or when it's going to turn into a book. Like, how do you navigate what to do with something God's inspiring you with to write about?
Yeah, and now there's also the outlet on social media.
That too?
Do you tweet out a one-line theme? Do you put a paragraph on Facebook? Those as well. Or radio isn't always. That's 2 hours a day, 5 days a week. So whatever's on my heart, whatever's on my mind, if I'm writing about it, I'm probably going to talk about it on some level as well. So that's a given. As far as preaching, that's always for the moment. This past Sunday I spoke at Fire at our home congregation. I had one message planned, but during the service felt a shift in my heart and just preached something entirely different, and that didn't turn into an article or anything. That was just a message for our congregation and for others that will hear it. Sometimes when I travel, I'm asked to speak on certain subjects because people know me from certain contexts. So that's just going to be praying into that and asking for a message accordingly. But when I'm working on a book, those themes are with me all the time. And whenever I feel a fresh push to do a chapter, I do my best to give myself to it, whether I'm flying in a plane, whether it's 2 a.m, whatever else is going on. That becomes all-consuming. When it's an article, that's something I want to get out right now. And will do my best to write it and get it sent out to be posted if it's at night, by the next morning or something like that. So it all depends on the subject matter. In other words, if there's something going on with the elections and I'm burdened to address it, and it has substance for an article, then I'm going to write an article. I'll probably talk about it on the radio, but that's not going to be part of a book. It's just a contemporary issue that I'm dealing with. But there is, when it comes to writing something with passion, with fire, that's what I'm gripped with the most. That's what burdens me the most, and that's where I have that sense I've got to get this out now. It's like delivering a baby in that respect. I've got to get it out.
Right. I remember when you were here in Peru years ago, and we were talking, and I asked you about writing and how you knew a book was in you and ready to come out. You said something almost exactly like that. Like you feel like it's just in you and has to come out. And that has helped me in writing and figuring out things that I think I should write or think I should put down, or that my first published book is about speaking in tongues. And that came from starting with writing little articles, somebody says this and I'm like, no, I don't have 30 seconds to answer you on that. So I'll go write something and then give it to you. And then it started to kind of collect into different points I was making. And then eventually I thought this might make a good book. And to date, it has panned out. And so that piece of advice made an impact on what I feel to focus on if the Lord's giving me something to write about. And so that's also another reason I wanted to talk to you about writing like this, because I know a lot of other indie authors or self-published authors who are going to listen to this, so I've got questions I've fielded from some of my friends too. You might not be surprised. So, what lifestyle habits do you have in place in your life so as to keep fostering the habit of writing? Is it part of like your prayer life? Is it something that's kind of like supplemental to, time in the secret place? Like how does that work with you and the way writing comes about?
There's nothing that I have to cultivate. It's who I am.
Right.
What I have to do is be sure that I give myself to it. And that means whatever the particular circumstances, travel, whatever else is going on. I may finish preaching, get back to my hotel room on the road, and now it's back to writing if I'm really gripped with something and in the midst of it. There is discipline involved when you're on a project. For example, in the early stages, you're so caught up with it and gripped by it that you're almost carried by, you have to focus on other things while you're doing other things because you so much just want to get away and write. So you got to focus on, who you're sitting in the office with and talking with at that moment and what else you're doing. Radio, of course, I'm always focused on when I'm doing that and preaching, but otherwise you got to pull away from writing to just do the mundane daily things. But then once you're involved longer with the project, there can now be, okay, I've got to annotate the whole thing. I've got to fill in lots of references. Now it's got to be carefully proofed and edited, before I'm going to send it out even for the editor to look at. With academic work, it can be, years of all of the little things that you don't like to do that you have to do to get the project to the end. So it's almost like that initial push carries you, but then there's the ongoing discipline of just working at it and going with it. For me, though, as I say, because I'm burdened to write these things, it's simply a matter of saying, okay, I'm going to push through and do this now. I'm tired, but I'm going to push through and do this. The other thing I think it's important to add, though, is when I'm writing a book, and it's not like my commentary on Job, which I'm just doing final editing on, and that's the editor and I agreed once I had submitted the manuscript, why don't I add a translation of the book? So while it's in the editing process, I'm working on it. That's almost like a physical workout, like, okay, 10 more reps kind of thing. It's like, all right, stay with it. One more verse, 2 more verses, do the hard work kind of thing. But otherwise, when I'm writing other books, I want it to be kind of like being carried on a riding lawnmower as opposed to pushing an old lawnmower through thick grass. If I'm not being moved by the thing, if I'm not carried by it, if I'm not gripped by it, if I can't wait to get back to writing that, then I'm not in the flow for that chapter. Then something is missing, and I want to step back and either see, okay, I need to look at this differently, or maybe this is a chapter for another book, or maybe it's just a little off track. That I want to be carried by it, and then hopefully as the person's reading it, they'll be carried by it. Right.
Yeah, that's very helpful. What are your tools of choice for writing? Maybe like a word processors or what you use on your, I don't know if you use a tablet, you stick to just a laptop, but what are your tools of choice for writing?
Yeah, well, I got my first computer in 1985, and it came with I got Microsoft Word back then, so I've always used Microsoft Word for writing. I did experiment with some academic software called Nota Bene, which has different fonts and things, and I'm getting into that a little bit late right now, so I haven't really used that full benefit. There's a Hebrew one called Dovka Writer that has other benefits, but again, that's a totally separate animal. So I've just used Microsoft Word over the years. And honestly, I use it in its fairly simple forms. I don't do a tremendous amount of formatting because I'm not laying a page out for my own book. The publisher's going to do that. And obviously with footnotes and endnotes, or endnotes depending on the project. And I'm either at my desktop or laptop. Probably the bulk of writing I've done over the years has been with my laptop because of so much travel and being on the road. I like having a pen in my hand, but that's more for writing down things before the Lord. My books have started with pen and paper. Our Hands Are Stained with Blood started with pen and paper because I was so overwhelmed and burdened with pain for my Jewish people that I couldn't get off my face, and I was overwhelmed to take the reader to the Holocaust with me. And I reached up on the desk and pull down a piece of paper and a pen and just started writing while laying on my face on the floor. And that's the first chapter of Our Hands Are Stained with Blood. But otherwise, yeah, laptop. I've used a tablet, but over the years, way before the iPad years and things like that. But that's more for just praying before the Lord and writing out a prayer request and, just liking to have that, or here are the projects I'm working on and just write that out so I can pray over it. But as far as writing books and articles, 99.9% of the time it's going to be about my laptop or desktop, just traditional in that respect.
Right. And I also have some questions to kind of segue into publishing. I know a lot of people listening to this, there's no barrier or there's no gatekeeper for most people who are listening to this because of, Kindle publishing and being able to self-publish so easily. But do you have thoughts like that? Like, before I ask you any specific questions, when you look at how things were when you started, and basically, having editors, having people who work like a team, or however it was for your books in particular, to publish something and get it out into bookstores and stuff. Do you have any thoughts or observations you've made with how it works now compared to whatever 30 years ago? And
yeah, well, there's good and there's bad. Just like with everyone being able to post their views on internet, there's bad. So the good is, over the years, it's increasingly hard to get books published as a first-time author. Publishers receive thousands and thousands and thousands of submissions, and only a few of them really get looked at. And then out of that, only a few of them will be published with new authors. So it's nice that people have an outlet, that if they have their own ministry or their own stream and they want to get material out, they can do it. It's nice that you don't submit the manuscript now to a publisher. Let's say it's approved and you have a contract, you submit it now and it comes out like 10 or 12 months later. You feel like, man, the whole world's changed in that time. So you can write the thing and have it out in a matter of days. I think that's tremendous. That's very positive. And if it's a good message, it can reach more people. The negative is now the thing hasn't been tested. So if I know that such and such a publisher published a book, that tells me something. To this day, that's the way it's going to be with academic work. You're gonna put it out with someone that's known, and it's going to go through a whole bunch of editing channels before the thing is finished. So it's going to be really sharpened. But that's the problem. That anybody can be an author, and being an author gives a certain amount of credibility, and a lot of people don't deserve the credibility. So it's the standard thing, just like on internet. There's good and there's bad through it. However, on a personal writing level, I did my best to learn from every editor. I would submit the manuscript the cleanest way that I knew how, proofed as carefully as I could, proper grammar, everything else. If Nancy was able to review it, she'd make some really excellent points, criticisms of, here's where the content wasn't strong, or this sentence was ambiguous. She reads really carefully and would help me. Of course, when you get the corrections, your feelings are hurt. You feel you produced this masterpiece, and maybe I'd finished writing late at night, and then the next morning, first thing, I'd print up what I wrote and review it. And by the way, that's always the process that I'll use, is to print up what I've written and look at it, because it's still going to look and feel different than on the screen. And if I don't have access to a printer, I have this, it's called digital paper. It's kind of a tablet that Sony puts out, real thin, weighs almost nothing, battery lasts for weeks and weeks and weeks. And all you can do is basically edit PDFs on it, mark them up and edit it. And so if I'm on the road, I don't have access to a printer, then I'll print, I'll just transfer the file to there in PDF form, and then I can read it, and it looks just like paper, and I can mark it up accordingly, and then enter the changes on my computer. But there's a lot of benefit to having editors work with you, and proofreaders and things like that. So there are enough freelance people that I highly recommend that people have their work done. I'm asked sometimes to write an endorsement for someone's book, and I'm looking at like, yikes, who edited this? And a lot of times the person just did their best, or a friend helped edit it. I'm thinking, you got hundreds of errors here, and it makes the book of less value.
Right.
It makes the person seem less credible. So little things I learned over the years, and even the cleanest manuscript I'll ever submit that I think is sharp and excellent, there'll still be dozens and dozens of queries from the editor. And what about this? And did you mean this? And okay, you cite this, but this doesn't seem to be the right edition of the book with this source. Little things are going to pick up. So to have a good editor is worth the investment, and it's a good learning experience for the author as well.
Right. I've had volunteer editors at first, and then gradually start paying something, and I remember my first lengthy book, Bert Farias's brother edited for me. And I remember taking weeks before giving it to him, just going over it and over it again until I was sick of it. And even then, it's still almost like a mess for him to he's sending it back to me with few hundred markups and notes and even there might not be errors, but there's this sentence makes no sense or something, or this, do you mean this when you're writing that? And there was a lot of feedback like that, not necessarily errors. I mean, I'm still learning the wonderful world of commas in my writing, but you can feel oh no, this is good. I've spent weeks working on it. It's edited. What are you talking about? But then, and I've put an email address in the front of all my self-published books so that people could contact me if they find errors. And I regret that, and I'm glad I did it at the same time, because then I get I had maybe a dozen emails the first week or two a book is published. So I've learned the hard way as I've gone about that. But I tell people all the time that you need someone to edit. If you can't spend much money, do whatever you can to put the money towards getting somebody to edit it.
And again, not only will you grow as an author doing it, but it will make your message more credible.
Right.
Look, just think if somebody writes to you and they misspell all the words, it makes them seem like they're not educated or they don't know what they're talking about. It'd be like me trying to say something in broken Spanish. I'm going to sound like a little child with a bad accent.
Right.
But no matter how smart I might be, if I know a few, trying to communicate with a few words of Spanish, I sound very silly to everybody. I remember I was in Korea one time, and there was one guy always smiling. It was my first trip there. It was 1990. He was always smiling and speaking very broken English. And so I just kind of pegged him to be this very nice, smiley guy that wasn't that bright because of the conversations we'd have. Then during a Q&A, after one of my sessions, he asked a question through a translator, and it was this deep, philosophical, profound question. I thought, yikes. I didn't realize that it was just the guy's limited English. It wasn't his limited understanding or his limited thinking power. So we don't want to work hard on a message that the Lord's given us. And just like people want the cover to look a certain way, if the cover looked cheap or chintzy or something like that, you're going to have a certain impression. Well, the same way, if a book's not properly edited, for many people, it's a distraction. And for others, it just makes the author look less credible. And then there'll be times when Nancy will say to me, this is no good. I said, what do you mean? She said, the whole way it starts is no good. And I'm a little offended, well, what do you mean? I mean, I worked hard on this. And she said, look at it. You're the author, look at it. And then I'll go back. It's oh, now I see your point. And I'll rewrite the opening paragraph. She goes, perfect. That's it. But I didn't see it until someone else looked at it. It's just like on a test I would give at school years ago. If it was, say, a true or false test, and there would be one question that half of the class would get wrong, even the best students, I'd look at it and realize, the question was ambiguous. I didn't see it like that. So the editing is really important, really helps. And do the thing right. If you're going to do it right. No shortcuts. And yes, by the time you're done with it, you do get a little bit sick of it because you've written it. And then for me, I've gone over every chapter, every page over and over and over and over again because I keep sharpening it, looking at it, sharpening it, looking at it, sharpening it, looking at it. Then you send it to the publisher. Then the editor sends it back. And now you've got to interact with all the editorial changes that have been requested. So sometimes it's real easy, but otherwise you got to read through your whole thing yet again. And then you send it back, and then they have it laid out on what's called the galley. So this is the final way it's going to look. And it's gone to the final proofreaders, and they say, all right, give it one more shot. Just make sure we didn't miss anything. At that point, you're kind of speed reading it because you want to be excited when the book comes out. You're almost bored by it because you've been over and over and over it, but in the end, you've got what you want.
Right. And it might not make sense why this is my next question, but have you ever thought of doing audiobooks for your books?
Yeah. First, if the publisher wants to do it, great. They'll finance it,
Right.
and I guess hire a reader to do it, or ask me if I wanted to do it. One guy in our congregation who does audiobooks as part of the work he does really got burdened to help me with it. So we said, all right, look, it's massive, but let's think about a queer thing happened to America. I mean, it's 700 pages. Even if you leave out the 1,500 endnotes, it's a big book. It's not the one you want to start with an audiobook. And we recorded the introduction together, but I was very dissatisfied with the feel of it. Not his fault at all. I didn't like the energy. I didn't know, because I hadn't listened to a lot of audiobooks before then. I didn't know what the proper format is. For example, when you're quoting someone, do you just use a different tone of voice? Do you, is it clearly distinguishable, etc.? So I thought, man, I'm going to have to learn that more before I do it. But in any case, I'd love to see them out, and maybe one day we'll put them out ourselves. Some of the shorter books, maybe I'll read myself if they're less technical. But yeah, it's just for some reason publishers haven't asked me about putting them out thus far.
Right. I didn't know if there was maybe a conscious reason on your part, or because I'm listening to a lot of audiobooks now, and I invested in some better stuff because I plan on doing my own books. And when I recently did my tongues book, I caught like 4 mistakes in the text.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. Like when you're reading it out loud, you definitely catch stuff.
Absolutely.
And, and I don't say that to make the publisher look bad, but just more like, even with all the eyes that look at something, the more angles you have for how to look at it, the better. And to just tie that back into the comments a moment ago about editing, if you're the only eyes looking at your book, you'll never catch this stuff. And this book I was using the what do you call it, the typeset that they were going to print with. So yeah. I was this audiobook hasn't seen the light of day. There were some problems with it, but I was like, well, if anything, having done the audiobook, having read it out loud to myself, I could catch these 4 mistakes before it goes to print.
Before that you caught.
Yeah, before who knows how many people read this book, and then right. And it makes everyone look bad, not just the author, right? But when like I think we were just I don't want to beat the point too hard, but editing, I'm always telling people that like it's worth whatever you have to pay to get or have to favorite for someone to get an editor.
When I send out my articles, they're edited by me. That's going to be the standard thing. You don't have an editor. I mean, unless you're maybe some professional newspaper writer and you have an editor or something, but otherwise you send in the articles. That's why you'll see articles sometimes have errors and typos and aren't as well written. Some write better than others. But I edit as sharply as I can. If there's a typo in it, then their editor will correct the typo if they spot it. Many times everybody misses it, and then a reader will point it out. But I can assure you and your listeners that my writing is, when I send something in, is very, very sharp compared to a lot of other authors. And I hear that from editors all the time, that they only need to do light editing on mine. And still, to reiterate, I'm shocked by how many things they have to clean up when they get it. The other thing, though, just to mention as far as audiobooks, is there a lot of people, when they read my book, they tell me they hear my voice. They hear me say it because it sounds and feels like me. So in that case, it may be very natural for you to read your own book, but not everyone has the right voice for it. Sometimes someone else reading it gives it a certain authority. I've listened to audiobooks read by a professional reader that were extraordinarily well done. And then I've listened to some that were by the author himself, and his voice kind of grated on me a little, and it was harder to get through.
Mm-hmm. See, and I don't know if people would like to hear me read my book or not. It's kind of like a risk I'm taking, because I've listened to some audiobooks where the author has done it. Their voice didn't grate on me, but they don't know how to present. They sound like they're reading. And, I've been practicing for a few years. I want to do this. I want to be good at it. So, it's a skill. It's a talent I'm aiming towards, because not every author should, likewise, not every author should read their book. Right. So speaking of
everything has a different rhythm. For example, when I went from preaching and teaching to radio, a leading radio guy talked to me in the early months and said, "Hey, I love your passion." He said, "But remember, you're having a conversation, a one-on-one conversation with someone driving in their car." Realize, sometimes you get really gripped about something, but basically radio is a whole different rhythm and feel. I've been doing that for 8 years now. And each thing, again, has its own kind of genre. Articles, for example, you can have the whole article is one sentence paragraphs. You're not going to do that normally in a book. Mm-hmm. So you've got to, completely shift your structure from book to article in terms of length of paragraphs and sentence structure and things like that. So you've got, same with an audiobook, you've got to kind of find the right rhythm for it that reflects who you are and what the book's about, and then test it out, do a short segment and ask people how it reads, how it sounds to them, Right.
So related to publishing, do you still have manuscripts that get rejected, even as a well-known author and radio personality? Do you have to go through the same process as first-time authors?
Well, I have, thankfully at this time, a good number of publishers asking me for manuscripts and when can you write a book on this, and will you write this or that for us? So I've got quite a few open doors, and I'm unable to walk through all of them at the same time, thankfully. But when I wrote A Queer Thing Happened to America, nobody would touch that. Now, I subsequently had 3 publishers apologize to me. And for example, I dialogued with Zondervan about that, and we agreed it wasn't the right fit. And my real goal was to get a secular publisher to put the book out, because the book does not presume faith or specific belief as I write. So that one we self-published. Now, 700-page hardcover, as I mentioned, almost 1,500 endnotes. The only reason it's like 690 pages. The only reason it's under 700 is because the endnotes are so tiny in the printed version. Otherwise, the book's probably about 730, 750 pages, because the font is so tiny for the endnotes. But between ebooks and hardcover, we sold, I think, since 2011 when it came out, probably about 18,000 books, something like that, which is staggering for a traditional publisher to hear, because a book that big, hardcover, that controversial, that publishers wouldn't even touch, to find out that it sold that amount self-published is pretty astounding to them. Thankfully, I was on Sid Roth's show that helped really birth things. We had friends like Lou Engle that put out an e-blast with me to help get the book out and stuff like that. But it was just God's grace, and I didn't have nearly as loud a voice as I do today on radio. It was definitely expanding then, but it's even louder now. Our social media was a fraction then of what it is now. So I do have some friends that exclusively self-publish. They have a good enough network, and they feel that it brings a ton more ministry money in, rather than just get, say, $1 on a $10 book or whatever the royalty is going to be. They'll end up with $7 or $8. Once the book is in a high enough, you print enough copies and it's inexpensive enough to print. So for them, that's the best way to do it. They have connections where they can get into bookstores and things like that. To me, I'm always looking at distribution and impact. Income is a completely separate thing. In fact, until recently, all my books were signed over to the ministry, so the ministry received all royalties, not me. And when a friend of mine for many years found out that we had no retirement account or anything set up, he insisted that we begin to get book income, and if we can, put money aside for the future and things like that. So the number one thing I'm looking at is impact. So if I had a choice between a book selling 5,000 copies, but somehow I could make $50,000 from that, or I didn't make a penny and the book reached 5 million, I wouldn't have to think twice about that.
Yeah, me neither.
So that's the benefit of a major publisher. They can really help get the thing out. But ultimately, a book's going to sell by word of mouth. It's that simple. The publisher will help with that initial burst, But if the book is not worthy, it's going to die there. And if it is worthy, even if it's self-published, the thing will take off like crazy and people will get it. So word of mouth is still the number one way to sell a book.
Right. And that kind of segues into one of my questions I wanted to ask you about platform, about how to get word out about your books and stuff like that. Because obviously you're the highest profile person I've ever had on this podcast. So you might have some different tactics with radio and being well known. But do you have any tips, advice for new or beginning authors about, godly ways they can promote their work?
The first thing really, and to this day it remains the same, is as I'm on my knees asking God to get his message out. I think of Matthew 3 and Matthew 17, where the first account Jesus is being baptized, the second account is the transfiguration. But the voice comes from heaven, "This is my son whom I love, with whom I'm well pleased." And it's added Matthew 17, listen to him. So that's always the deepest thing in me. If God is with me and God has birthed this message, that he will help get it out, that he will say to the world, listen to that person, listen to Steve, listen to Joe, listen to Samantha, listen to them. And it will get out in that way. So that remains my number one focus. And I've worked with major publishers, and the thing just didn't go where we expected it to go. And then when we kind of reconfigured it, I had one publisher years ago. They insisted on a title I didn't like. They insisted, but I wanted to get the book out. I agreed to the whole thing. It went nowhere, absolutely nowhere. I ended up buying the books back from them, putting it out with the title that I wanted, and the thing absolutely took off. They made me leave content out initially, etc. So I've seen it where just getting the right message out the right way is what caused it to take off. But number one, really, really pray. The God that moved on you to write is the God that can open the doors and get the book distributed. The second thing is do your best to be edifying people on a regular basis through social media and other means that you have. You've got a podcast. Others can easily do that. It could be a blog. It could just be Twitter feed, could be Facebook or Instagram, whatever. But sow into other people on a regular basis. If God's gifted you with a message, with insight, pour that into people on a regular basis, and that will promote itself. The next thing, things will begin to increase. The interest will be there. More people will share what you have. So, for example, we work hard, my team and I, to be constantly putting out quality content. So with that content, we now have an increased audience. And with that increased audience, now when a book comes out, instead of 100 people finding out about it, maybe it's 1,000, or maybe it's 10,000, or maybe it's 50,000, and they can hear right off the bat. So constantly be sowing into others with the message. That you say, well, do I have an ulterior motive? Do I just do it to build my audience? Well, if that's the case, then the message is not that important to you. If the message is really important to you, you want to get it out, and you want people to hear it, and you know it's important. So it's twofold. You're saying something, and you're increasing your audience. And then there are other things you can do to increase the audience. For example, if you have good graphics and you post them on Facebook, those tend to be shared more. Perfectly ethical. There's nothing wrong about doing it. It's not like you're putting a porno picture up to draw people in and then tell them I've got this great Christian book on sexual purity, God forbid. But you're saying, hey, here's a great quote on this. It's not mine, but I like it. Here's the graphic, attributed to the right person. Let's put it up because graphics get more attention. So if you can find out what works well in each different social media, and then when a book is coming out, begin to announce it in advance. If you're writing an article, or if you have a blog, always identify yourself as that author of thus and such, coming out thus and such month. Do that. The other thing that you can do is start to publish little excerpts, or here, to read this opening chapter free. Click here. I just got it from a well-known medical doctor whose nutritional plan we follow. It's called a new book called The End of Heart Disease by Dr. Joel Fuhrman. Download the opening chapter free. It's like, man, awesome. So if you have the ability to do that, and then once it's out, just ask everybody, hey, if you like this book, write a review. If you're blessed by it, post a review. You do not want to solicit dishonest reviews. In other words, somebody writes a negative review attacking your book. I get that with some of my controversial ones. All my books are controversial, so I get that a lot. And that bothers you because it's a 1-star review from someone who didn't read the book, who just hates your guts. But you don't want to ask someone to write a 5-star review who hasn't read it, or just ask them to do it. So you always want to be honest. Hey, if the book has blessed you, take a moment to write a review. And those reviews really help get the book out. It's practical. Look, I go to order something online. I'm not familiar with it. What do you look at? The ratings, right? 3,000 reviews of this product, 4.5 stars. That's good. Mm-hmm. And then I'll immediately read the 1-star ones just to see if there are any flaws in the thing, to double check.
Right.
So that's helpful as well. It goes a long way.
I think there's a trap indie authors fall into, and I've written on my blog about this, where indie authors review each other's books to help, have rankings, have, reviews on Amazon, so that customers who are going to buy it see there's already reviews. And I no longer do this, by the way, but at first I started to, and the people who would review my book, they would have their review up like the same day they asked me. And here I am, I'm like reading their book. So I quickly wised up to it, and I realized, a lot of authors don't actually read each other's books, and they go and they write a 5-star review, and it's so vague. It could be about any book and stuff like that. And I'm hoping like some Amazon customers or whatever are starting to wise up to that too, that just because a book has maybe like 10 5-star reviews and they're all vague doesn't mean that actual readers have started to read it and review it yet. That's another thing I don't know if you've seen happening.
No, years ago, there was a guy, I was on his email list, and he'd write a new book, and the moment there was a negative review, he kind of would send out an e-blast like the sky was falling kind of thing, and people are trying to attack him. Sometimes it's true, and I've done that. It's like, you've got to check out this latest review. I mean, it's so ridiculous and ugly. I want people to see it, and then I want them to be prompted, hey, if you read the book, write a positive review. But, sometimes I'll just do it because it's so absurd and I want to have a little fun with it. But he'd send out these emails like, the world is collapsing, and could you just write a positive review? And then I go to Amazon to check like 6 hours later, 8, however long it takes to process the thing before it's posted. Or I check the next day, and there'd be like 50 new reviews, all 5-star, and just one line. It's like, you didn't even read the book. So look to see if it's verified purchase, etc. By the way, the other thing is, if you can get some good endorsements, those do help a lot. Mm-hmm. To this day, if I see someone's endorsed a particular book, that means everything to me, and I'm willing to take a serious look at it. Right. But then even with that, I get asked to endorse books and write forwards day and night, and you don't want to cheapen things by just doing everything. Plus, there's not time anyway.
Right. And to be honest with you, I purposely didn't ask if you would endorse my book, because I assumed you must be getting a lot of people who request that of you. And I sent you a copy of the book. Dr. Peters told me he gave it to you because I just...
Yes, I have it in my office.
Right. Yes. I just wanted you to have it, like I didn't have... That's the other thing too, is like, I think people can sense when there's strings attached, when there's like, oh, by the way, that's coming on the back end of it. And I remember I just wanted you to have a copy of this book, because you and 2 other people, like 5-6 years ago, were a big reason that I kind of opened my eyes that I could write a book. I could write something, so I just wanted to gift it to you. I didn't want to be another person asking for that type of favor, because I assume
that's how I received it. And look, right. I'm always happy, any that's part of our spiritual family. I'm always happy to do my best to help in any way that I can. But again, it becomes, a limitation of time, and you don't want to cheapen things in the process. But it's always fine to ask. And look, when you had some things on, reduced price or giveaway, whatever, that you can do with Kindle, where it's, you can put the book out for up to 5 days in a year for nothing.
Yeah.
Get out to the maximum. I remember doing that with one of my books, and then people got the book for free and then criticized me for writing a book you had to pay for. It's like, buddy, first, it costs money to publish your book. No matter who does it, it costs money to publish the thing you're reading your hand. Second, you get the ebook free. But in all seriousness, though, when when you asked me to do that, could I let people know? I think I tweeted it out. I even posted it on Facebook. I can't, we get asked to help out constantly. So I have to be very, very selective. Our Facebook fans, it's like over 350,000 now. So we've got to be judicious in what we do. So I can't do that for everyone all the time. But again, as a spiritual son and, a grad, with a project that was out, sure, let me get this out and try to help. So it's always fine to ask, just ask respectfully.
Right.
You have to assume, it's just like if somebody is like a billionaire, everybody wants to ask that person for money for their great, their latest and greatest project, whatever. And what you want to do is build a relationship and be a blessing in the person's life. And then if it's appropriate, say, hey, we've got this project you may be interested in. The same thing with if someone has enough clout, they're getting requests day and night. Look, I found out years back with pastors of churches. Now it's probably a lot through email, but you'd see the amount of mail that came into a church with maybe 100 people, and all the missionaries that wanted to speak for them, and all the traveling guests that wanted to speak for them, and all the requests to do. It's just a little church, and so now you got a church of like 20,000. You're not just going to walk in and say, hey, pastor, would you be able to just write this endorsement and tell all your people that I've got this new book? It's right. Like, yeah, you're number 9,000 this week asking for it. So just people need to be respectful. And when I get something from someone that's really honoring, that's really has the right spirit about it, that gets my attention. I don't mean they're groveling or praising me in some way, but you could just tell the right spirit, that they're sincere about this, that they're not mercenaries, that they're not in this for self-aggrandizement. That goes a long way.
Right. Yeah. Well, how many more minutes do you have left before we got to end this?
We committed to an hour, and,
Yeah.
and we started about 5 minutes after, so it gives us about 11 minutes, I think.
Okay. Well, yeah. I mean, I'm more than happy to take however little or however much time you've got. I asked the highlighted questions on my list that I wanted to make sure to get in there. But I did have something that came to my mind as I was thinking of these things about books that maybe you've been working on that have never seen the light of day, or you still not yet. And the one in particular, it was about 12 years ago. I had a class with you on Jeremiah, and on the last day, you told us there's no exam, but I want to share with you from this book I'm working on. And it was about house churches, if I recall. Mm-hmm. And I always wondered, like, what happened to that? Did you decide, it wasn't flowing, or, in this conversation, you talked about how if you're not feeling it, you don't go with it and stuff. But I've always personally been curious about that, because the crux of the ministry I'm doing down here happens to mostly be in houses and stuff. And I'm attracting a lot of people who are organic or doing stuff like that. So I've always had this curiosity about whatever became of that.
Yeah, I've got a few unfinished projects like that. Not many, but I've got a few. So I have the file under that book title. And the focus of this was spiritual elitism. Uh-huh. And what happened was, as I was finishing my Jeremiah commentary, I remember while working on the introduction, once the commentary was finished, I was working on the introduction to it, and suddenly got flooded with ideas, which hit so fast I could barely write all the ideas down. I remember it was pen and paper, could barely write the ideas down for chapters and things, which is normally really how a book gets heavily birthed in me. And anyway, as I did that, I started writing feverishly these little chapters, which dealt with house churches, but really with the larger issue of spiritual elitism. And there was a pronounced movement then that was extremely judgmental towards the rest of the body, which was my biggest issue. Meeting in a house or not was completely secondary to me. Meeting in a house is the primary thing, was completely secondary to me. That was not the issue. The issue was the attitude of the heart. So I pitched it to one particular publisher that I thought would really want to go for it. And to my surprise, they were negative on it. And I challenged them. I said, are you negative on it because you've gotten into the same spirit and attitude yourselves? Because I'd seen some authors they'd worked with put out this, this is the real church, the organic church, and everybody else is the institutional church, that kind of thing. And then they didn't want to go with it, and I left it there. And then for whatever reason, just got caught up in other projects and never got back to it. I believe it's still relevant, but in the circles in which I travel, it doesn't seem as relevant. Now it could be out there, and I'm just not aware. But it seems that the reactionary nature of this has lessened some over the years. Even one prominent author that would have written about these things years ago would say that he was less mature in some of his tone years back in addressing issues, etc. And there's so many authors. I mean, pick any of 100, so rather than try to figure out who I'm talking about. So I just did not see the pressing need for it as much. But I still have a number of chapters. And if the thing rises up again in a major way, or people start warning about getting out of Babylon, and the organized church is Babylon, and if you're not in the house church, it's Babylon, then I could easily get the thing out and finish it.
Right.
But I have tons of unfinished projects, rabbis writing hundreds of pages critiquing my 5-volume series on answering Jewish objections to Jesus. And because some were colleagues, people I knew that I respected, I started to write rebuttals. I haven't finished those. One guy wrote a whole book attacking my hyper grace book, and his book is easily dismantled, but I just haven't gotten around to writing a full rebuttal of his. Right. And those I just put out like as ebooks, either free ebooks or very inexpensive, just to circulate to the most people the least expensive way. But I've got, scholarly articles I never finished. That's just the nature of putting stuff out constantly.
Right. So how many drafts do you think you've got on your computer at any given moment that are going to become books or ebooks or longer form writing?
So drafts meaning part of a book?
Could be part of a book or something. It's up to you to interpret it how you want, because I feel like I've got about 4 or 5 things on the go at any given moment on my computer.
Yeah. I mean, that's that. If you look at things that I haven't finished that I want to get to one day, hopefully if the Lord's in it, then that's going to be much higher number. That's going to be 8 or 10 or more. But in terms of ongoing projects, there are always several that I'm working on at once. The book I'm finishing, the book I'm starting, the academic project I'm involved with. So right now it would be just putting the finishing touches on this book about lifestyle transformation. What we in-house call the fat book. Fat no more kind of thing. So just finishing that up. Then this new one that I'm working about in terms of the state of America and how to reverse things in a very holistic way. The Job commentary, the final editing on that, and then future projects that we're mulling over now and thinking through, what to approach or what to go with next with a publisher. So, and then the old ones that are just sitting there. So but there are always 2 or 3 active that I'm working on at the same time.
Okay. I've also written down about how I've noticed over the years sometimes your books are directed at other people or other books. Like I read Authentic Fire in like a couple days, which is obviously in response to Strange Fire, The Real Kosher Jesus, and you mentioned what's his name in his Hyper Grace book.
Hyper Grace.
Yeah. And so I've always been curious about that. Well, at least in recent years, been curious about that. How you feel that burden when you need to write a book that's specifically to kind of counter another book in particular.
Yeah. I mean, some has been very intense, like Real Kosher Jesus and Authentic Fire. Both of those books I wrote in 3 weeks. And Authentic Fire I probably wrote over 300 pages in 3 weeks, and Real Kosher Jesus about 250 pages in 3 weeks. So I just got gripped. I got overwhelmingly gripped with the burden that I need to say something, that I need to respond. These are public issues being discussed in public forums, and I need to respond. Hyper Grace, I knew I needed to write I was working on a book about contemporary gospel error, and it just wasn't flowing. There's this problem, it just wasn't flowing. And I don't feel like I'm God's policeman, and I'm the one that's just supposed to sit around and fix everybody and correct everybody. So I want to be burdened, and what I write, I want to bring life. I don't want to write out of frustration, but out of the burden of the Lord. And then it really coalesced around Hyper Grace, the more I was confronted with that error. But even then, I wasn't sure do I just address the issues and leave out the authors' names completely? Or do I quote the authors, reach out to as many as I can in advance, ask them to look at the material, see if they want to interact with me on it, if they want to change their views in any way? I wasn't sure how to handle that. And while I was in India preaching, I finished my first message to a few hundred pastors and church planters, and it was a very strong, challenging word, and we all just turned down on our knees and started to cry out to God. And as I was on my knees, the Spirit said to me, you know exactly what you need to do. And I knew that meant cite authors by name. I do it graciously, I do it fairly, but I really had to pray before I felt to do that. Whereas the John MacArthur thing, I had a burden to do it, and here in a very public way, he's addressing public issues. So whenever you can get to someone privately, you do. But basically, if you said something on national TV an hour ago that was outrageous, and God just gave you revelation in Peru that Jesus is coming in like 12 and a half hours, and everyone, run out in the street and start preaching. And then I'm doing a radio show and someone said, hey, I just heard Pastor Steve made this announcement, on his big TV show. Dr. Brown, what do you think? I don't need now, let's say I don't know you at all. I don't need to try to track you down and contact you and say, hey, I'm going to take issue, because you said something publicly that's causing confusion. I now need to address it publicly.
Right.
But whenever you have the opportunity to address someone behind the scenes, you do it. I sought to do that with John MacArthur in article form and other ways, and that never had an audience. So once the conference came and God moved on me, then I knew I got to get this book out.
Right. I've got some of your books here, from the past anyway,
Yeah.
Nowadays I read them mostly on Kindle format, but I remember when Authentic Fire came out, I probably read that in just a few days because I was working on my tongues book, and I remember going to it to see if you had stuff I could quote, because stuff like that is also what burdened me. I know so many people who I feel they're missing out on stuff from having grown up in a non-charismatic atmosphere, and then I went to Fire, and I felt like that has helped inform me of what exactly are the misconceptions people have. And so for me, something like Strange Fire was just like frustrating, and my particular book about speaking in tongues was like a draft sitting on my computer. And when that kind of stuff came out, that was like the push, like I gotta get on with this. I gotta get this finished. And so I relate, and I'm understanding more about how that burden works. But depending on how many more minutes you have left, I'm curious how you also take the burden aspect of it, and like, I don't know if you want to call it market research or about the book on house churches a moment ago. You were mentioning how you didn't see like it's out there to, in the same way as before to really go for it. I'm wondering how you balance those two aspects.
Yeah, well, I can answer this. This may be just looking at the clock.
Yeah, it can be the last question. That's fine.
This will be the last one. I first, studied very intensely for years before I was doing any writing. In the Word day and night for years, and then all of the academic research and languages and literature and stuff like that. So I built a foundation before starting to write a lot. That's been very, very important. And then when I'm working on a project like Job, I'm just consumed with Job. I got to read Job commentary I possibly can, and going through the book, use these resources. I'll just bring those home and just, have those right near my computer, on the bookcase. But otherwise, whenever I start getting interested in the subject, I start getting books. I'm not normally around a good academic library that would have everything I need, so I'd order books. Sometimes I end up just giving them to our school library after I was finished. But I just dive into the thing. And then you kind of get on a little trail, like, oh, there's a whole series of books. Oh, I didn't know all these guys were talking about this because it's a new area. So you start reading and reading and reading and reading. And then the more you're reading, it's either confirming what you know or informing it or so on. So you end up with this burden that grows as you're doing the research. It's kind of like those are logs being thrown into your fire. And for me, every good quote I get, every good insight I get, that's a jewel. I love to put that in the book. I love to quote it. I love to cite it. I love to build the case, that I'm making. So the research flows naturally out of the burden for the thing I'm writing. It just is a natural. It's hand in glove, actually, and that's how I learn new areas because you get asked a question about it, you don't have an answer, or you feel, man, I need to write about this, but I need to learn more and research more, and then it flows out of that.
Right. Well, I'm as far as the clock goes, it's been an hour, and I'm very grateful that you could do this. I normally have a very conversational chat with people, but because I knew I had a lot I wanted to ask you, I kind of went more into interview mode for the sake of time. But is there any last... when I have people on, I normally ask them if they have a book or they have something they want to promote.
Well, my newest book will actually be out in May. It's called The Grace Controversy. And Charisma, after Hypergrace, said, hey, some other new books have come out, and would you write a book maybe with the 10 or 12 most common questions that come up about grace and hypergrace? So it's a complete new book. It's short. It's about 200 pages. There's only one quote from any other hypergrace author in the book, and that's just like a short phrase. Otherwise, I'm just dealing with the issues, but from a totally different approach, really grounding people in grace even more. So if someone has hypergrace, this is a perfect supplement. It's a whole different book, very, very few pages in common. And for someone that didn't read the first one, this is a much easier read. So it's The Grace Controversy, comes out the first week in May.
Okay. Well, hopefully this podcast will help you sell a lot of copies of it.
Hey, man, let's do it. Let's do
right.
it. If it becomes 3 times bestseller, we'll attribute it to this.
Sure. But in serious, you with how you mentioned asking nicely, could I contact you again when this link is ready in case you wanted to share it, or your team?
No, we'll gladly share it. And honestly, interviews I do, we always do shorter just because of, only so many hours in a day.
Right.
But because I know you put a lot of effort into the podcast, and you've got a good following with it, and again, you're part of our spiritual family, I wanted to spend extra time. So hopefully it'll be of value, and sure, we'll definitely promote it to folks.
Right, because even people who don't write, I think they're going to get stuff out of this. Okay, well, thank you again, Dr. Brown. I'm going to let you go.
God bless you, man.
Have a good day. God bless.
I'm proud of you, buddy.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks. All right.
Well, did you get a lot out of that? Did you enjoy that discussion with Dr. Brown? I'm still kind of like in awe that I was able to pull it off and that he was willing to come on my show. So I needed to follow up about Matthew Robert Payne. Seems a lot of people didn't know what to do with him. I've got longtime listeners who got in touch with me. I had complete strangers get in touch with me, tell me, you know what, I loved that episode. I seldom have ever done a podcast episode in 9 years that got me as much feedback quantitatively, I'm not talking negative or positive, but just the quantity of feedback as this episode. And I think one of the things that backfired on me, I will admit this, is by titling blogs of mine with questions, because that seems to just invite people's answers. And when you post a podcast with a question mark like, should prophets charge for personal words or personal prophecies? You get people just giving you straightforward their answer, and some of them going on a rant, attacking me, attacking Robert, but mostly Robert. I was more like just the messenger. And on the one hand, I felt a little bit guilty because, Robert just really took a beating. I watched in some places on Facebook, and it's I feel partly responsible because I invited him to be a guest on my show, and on the one hand I had no idea what we would talk about, so I had no idea what would come up. I sent a raw file of this to Dave Edwards and asked him if he could listen to it from start to finish and give me his advice on how I should handle it, because of course I didn't agree with everything Matthew said. But when I prepared that interview, and I knew I was going to be recording with him, the Lord told me, treat Matthew as a guest on your show the same way you would treat Dr. Brown as a guest on your show. And then when I recorded that interview, I immediately knew why. And what happened was I was just letting him have his piece. I think as a podcaster, and if I want to do more high profile interviews, I'm hoping to get good at it and learn how to listen to my guests. What I'm going to do for the rest of my time with you today is I just want to give you some feedback. Okay. This almost all of what I'm going to share with you is from Facebook, a few private messages. None of the private messages I'll use names. Some of the feedback I share, I won't use names anyway, but hey Steve, great podcast. I listened to it today. My initial response was when I saw the title was that it would be wrong to charge for prophecies. I felt that way for a long time. However, after listening to the podcast, I'm giving it some second thoughts. I was thinking that preachers get an offering for preaching at a guest church. Authors get paid to write. Singers get paid to sing. Each of them would consider that a gift from God, and they don't seem to mind getting paid to operate in their gift. It has definitely made me think. I appreciate your and Matthew's dialogue. I was stretched a bit by some of his experiences and thoughts, but it was an interesting dialogue. I'm even considering sending him some money for a word. Keep up the good work. That was from a friend of mine and Lily's, Michael Wilson, longtime listener of the podcast, and we chat through Skype from time to time. There were some people who offered their testimony about Matthew. Here's something worth noting. Before sitting down to read these testimonies, I was going through Praying Medic's timeline because he shared a link to this podcast and it stirred up a firestorm. This podcast being the one with Matthew. And so a lot of people chimed in. A lot of people, offered their thoughts. And so it started to get to the point where some people would jump in and say, hey, have you listened to the podcast for yourself? Did you hear what Matthew has to say? He's hardly a charlatan. He's hardly some guy preying on people to get their money. So some people jumped in also to defend Matthew's character. They were offering testimonies about his stunning accuracy. There were people who started off totally against the idea. Throughout the day, I guess, Matthew wound up giving this person a prophetic word. I believe she charged, I'm not sure, but she said this to him publicly for everyone to see. Oh, Matthew, thank you. Best prophetic word I ever got. And you heard right. I didn't get, for some reason, many prophecies at the numerous conferences I have attended over the past 2 decades, but God knows. So she started off basically adamantly against this. And by the end of the day, went for it and got a prophetic word from him. I believe it was one that she went to a site, offered him the payment. She goes on to say, between the beginning of this post and the prophetic word from Matthew, I have done a 360. I think she might mean a 180 because a 360 is just turning around in a circle and facing the same way you were before. So I think she means a 180. I should pay for his time when I request a service. If he feels led to prophesy to the dude on the bench outside, that is a different thing. When I contract his time out, it is business. His words are stunningly accurate and yes, life-changing. Individual, the way only God knows how to address you. I found that his website is run very humbly, not by greed. This was a delightful process and thank you for initiating it. Now, what could Steve charge me for now? And then there was another girl who I found out went to BRSM around the time that I went to Fire. She said, I haven't listened to the podcast yet. I could never charge anyone for a word that was freely given to me by the Holy Spirit. They are gifts, aren't they? So why should we charge for using the gifts that were freely given to us? Besides, I get so blessed in my heart when God uses me. That's payment enough for me. Then later, she was indicating she still didn't listen to the episode yet. I wasn't able to listen to it, but was reading what people have said in this thread, made me open to the idea, and so I requested a word and gave a donation to Matthew, and he gave me a word that made me cry because the Lord showed him who I was and encouraged me about a loved one and that I care so deeply about. It really lifted me up. I'm really glad I was open instead of just staying closed-minded because I would have missed out on being blessed. So then somebody else said, my first thought was that it was wrong to change. Then I remembered, LOL, every face-to-face word I've received from a church conference or a church retreat, I have paid for, either in an offering or an entry fee. So the church is doing this, why shouldn't individuals? I personally won't charge, but I'll say no to people too if I'm exhausted or busy with family stuff. In that sense, I won't just give it away. Praying Medic brought up a good point. I think the biggest problem is that people do become dependent on prophetic words instead of learning to hear God's voice for themselves. Fix one problem and you fix the other. He also said, I wonder if Christians will not charge for a prophetic word because they're not sure they can deliver a word that's worth the asking price. Great discussion. I would add that the question of requesting/receiving payment is not reserved for prophetic ministry only. Any worship leaders or musicians out there, very often they are expected, both in the religious and secular world, to donate their gifting or talents. Counselors, yes, they can charge for their services, if it is secular, but if they charge for deliverance ministry, they may be accused the same way that these prophetic ministers are accused. And ministers, usually they are given a salary, but are expected to donate more time and energy than they are paid for and have to work a second job just to make ends meet. All right, so bear with me. I've got just a couple more things. This one was anonymous. It was a private message, and I have their permission to share it. I thought it was interesting that Matthew, mentioned people didn't take him seriously if he didn't charge or didn't see his ministry as a real ministry to support. I can definitely relate to that, but my feelings on it are that this is the fruit of a spirit of mammon on the church. The Apostle Paul described the same thing, people not taking him seriously because he didn't push them around or lord it over them. I've laid hands on people who had an encounter with the Lord that they didn't have in years of going to church and tithing, and helped young people to start practicing spiritual gifts. People near me have seen the fruit and seen that I was going to a lot of different countries and learning different languages to help people. Yet many of them continue to tithe to a church and respond to manipulation, but don't seem to have ever considered helping me do what I've done. In my opinion, this is often the fruit of a spirit of mammon, which judges and measures people by things of the flesh. Yet Jesus comes in a humble package. I have felt that to then charge because that's what gets people to take you seriously would simply be to bow to the spirit of mammon. I can't do the same thing just because it gets results. He goes on to say, sometimes I've seen what it seems to take to become a popular preacher, recognized and networked with other ministers, and just thought, I can't do that kind of flattery. And I want to interject right there. That's actually why I got in touch with Dr. Brown. Back in September, I saw that he posted a Charisma article to kind of answer the charges people have against him, that he's just living high on the hog off of his book sales. He writes about the gay stuff, the queer thing happened to America and these things because it makes him money. And he basically put out an article explaining, look, the royalties I get on a book and the expenses my ministry has and stuff, I don't make money on these books and stuff. And so I wrote him and asked, because I said, you know what? I know I'm called to write. I'm burning with, these books and stuff. And I don't have a platform, but I've got friends. I've got some acquaintances I see doing stuff that it just seems like the Holy Spirit in me won't let me do. And so I resonated with his brother who says this about, I've seen what some other people do. I see things that looks like it works. And to quote what I've heard Dr. Brown say many times over the years, sometimes the Holy Spirit tells us others can, you can't. So I got one more I want to read to you. Like I said at the beginning, this was going to be a good chunk of time. It's for this reason I put it at the end of this podcast today. But those of you who trudged through it, I hope this rewards you because, like the Facebook thread, which I think had like over 150 comments, not to mention all those little sub kind of, comments over the course of a few days. A lot of people spoke quickly and didn't stick around to listen, that kind of stuff. And then kind of like those of us who had been reading it, all the comments and having this conversation, I think we were left with tears in our eyes with this following. And I'm basically going to read the whole thing. And the only thing that I've edited to kind of speed things along is just some kind of like side comments he had made. But basically says, I was finally able to set aside the time to listen together with Julie, his wife, tonight and heard it from start to finish. Can I ask you all a question? Did you ever listen to some of the amazing talents out in the world? Perhaps an amazing singer, I meant to say. Or for me, someone with phenomenal talent playing the guitar. I'm talking about someone It is absolutely obvious they are anointed to do what they do, and yet it seems on the outside they have just spent their God-given talent on the world. Did you ever wonder how someone so gifted has spent it the way they have? I know I've had numerous conversations with Father about a number of those individuals. Did you know that a large majority of those above aforementioned individuals are using the world as an outlet for their gifting because the church refused to have them, or at least with a gifting they were created to use specifically to glorify God? For some of those, there was also a different concern beyond their gifting being received. It had to do with a lack of honor concerning their calling, and how that would affect their ability to live and provide for their family if they had to rely on a dysfunctional church to pour in the resources necessary to equip them to devote the time necessary to see their gifting to maturity. I do know this. Our gracious, wonderful, good Heavenly Father does expect us to be fruitful and multiply, and more appropriately, He expects our return on His investments as much as He expects us to gain increase on our investments, as exhibited in the parable of the talents. In fact, in that parable, He had some tough words for the one who considered Him quite a taskmaster, or expecting a return on his investment. So I know I've not talked about this with any of you, and very few since I came into the kingdom June 29th, 1978, at about 1 or 2 in the afternoon. Yes, it really was that profound and radical. Perhaps we will talk about it sometime. I want to thank both Steve Bremner and Matthew Robert Payne for investing their time in the podcast they presented for us to listen to and perhaps consider some things in a different light. I know that it did for me. It caused me to consider some things I haven't thought about in many years and probably wish would have just stayed in the background in the past to never haunt me again. I have a confession to bring into the light, and I have all of you to thank for it, especially the negative commenters. Did you know that I've run from the call of my life for many, many years after coming into the kingdom? I learned to love hiding behind the scenes, even though the prophetic has been in operation for the whole time. There are many, many I've prophesied to behind the scenes or hidden in a prayer prayed over them. In these later years, I've come out in the open much more, whether in providing prophetic words at conferences under the leadership or the particular conference, over the particular conference, or as part of the ministry team of a fellowship in Indiana, among others. Do you know why I ran so hard from the call into ministry that incidentally has never been revoked? It's because I didn't trust my well-being and livelihood to the majority of those I saw in the body of Christ. There, I said it. I tried, believe me, but ultimately I couldn't manage to do it. I just didn't manage to plow through. I had numerous conversations with God over it. I wondered why, if I was doing what I was supposed to be doing, why wasn't I being supported to grow, mature, and climb higher? God doesn't violate our freedom to choose. Not mine, not yours. That was hard for me because when I talked to Father God about it and asked Him why provision wasn't coming, He told me it was because He chooses to use the body to work through. He said He was doing His part by speaking of the need into the hearts of various people, but they weren't listening and weren't responding. I know, quite the serious indictment, isn't it? Can I ask you a different question? Why is it in the hospitality industry, restaurants, on a Sunday, let's just say the waitresses would do anything not to have a table full of church people? I can tell you that one. We've been known as the most ungrateful, rude, cheap, tipping people, if any at all, that this particular industry has ever seen. Does that help give perspective? For now, I just want to say, we have a long way to go in the area of honor, which incidentally is a valuable currency in the kingdom. So I want to ask your forgiveness as representatives of the body of Christ. Believe me, I've paid a high price for my personal decision, and so have a number of others that God longed to bless through what He longed to do. On a positive note, I want you to know that I will not hide behind the scenes any longer. We were all born for such a time as this. Julie and I will pour ourselves out to the best of our ability. But without others catching a vision and partnering together, we, like most any others called to ministry, we will be severely limited. It's just how it works. In closing, I just want to leave you with a question. Why do we place value on the pastors but not on the other ministries? With time being the most valuable commodity in the earth, why do we express such little value on the time of those that try to freely pour things of value into our lives? Mic drop. So I don't normally take nearly as long as that to share feedback, but this episode was getting me some done with church type of feedback. Those episodes would always provoke, and I don't think I'm even done hearing about this episode. But that last comment right there, that makes podcasting for the last 9 years worth it. You know what I mean? Like I thought of taking time to make a separate episode to just talk about this feedback, but I really felt like attaching it on the back end of the interview with Dr. Brown, because I know more people would hear it than normal. I bear witness with a lot of stuff this last guy, Brian, said, because I felt the same way as a missionary. I felt the same way that, I know God's birthed writings in me. He gave me this podcasting platform. He gave me this. I just enjoy, setting up my microphone and sitting in front of the laptop and recording something that people are going to be blessed by. And when I read something like an episode of my podcast was a catalyst for someone to repent and get their life in order, to stop running from the calling on their life. When I think of how the work that goes into just one MP3 that's going to go onto somebody's phone or their iPod or their computer or whatever, and can impact people. Dr. Brown was talking in our interview about that burden that grips you, and you feel like if you have to push an old lawnmower through tall grass, and as opposed to riding a lawnmower easily. I feel like that. I feel like that's the path that this takes me. This podcast, my writing, my blogs, and when I approached Dr. Brown and asked him about talking about the subject we did today, and I look at the last episode with people that are getting prophecies from Robert, I know people's lives are going to be touched by this episode. You're going to, take away from some of the things Dr. Brown was sharing for excelling in your writing and learning to trust your editor and godly promotional tips. Maybe some of you listening, you've never bothered to sit down and start writing something, but this is the catalyst that's going to do it. When I think of how that thread on Praying Medic's Facebook page with a podcast that, God has skilled me and given me the history of, practice for years, along with a guest who has been practicing his prophetic gifting and stuff, and how God just throws all that into the skillet and mixes it together. And look at some of these people's lives who are being touched. So I encourage you to check out Matthew. There were some issues I addressed at the end of the last podcast, because God works through imperfect vessels. He admitted to being bipolar. He's on a disability. This strategy for having a website and being able to give people prophetic words, he's using his gifts and blessing people, and at the same time is providing income, not for just his living, but to go and write books, because writing is another passion of his. So I was more impressed with that aspect and the ingenuity of that than I was shocked by the idea of selling prophetic words. But if you write, or you're supposed to write and you haven't started yet, what's stopping you? Another aspect of this, I'm going to close with a little message Praying Medic sent me yesterday, where he said, "By the way, I want to thank you for taking a risk in interviewing Matthew. He is a hot potato." You know what a hot potato is, right? And I know that you were uncomfortable posting the podcast. Whenever we associate with risky people, we take a chance that we are going to alienate our base of support. I found that my own base of support is a fairly risky group of people themselves when I bring in another risk taker, it usually turns out well. He names somebody by name and says, "This sister paid for a prophetic word from Matthew and got wrecked by it. another person who was initially opposed to the idea, but who, after listening to the podcast, decided that she wasn't seeing things correctly. We might tick off a couple dozen people, but there have definitely been some hearts that have been changed for the better, and that's the fruit I generally look for. And I think that that note that he sent me, he wrote to encourage me. I obviously know that, but that sums it up right there. Like, that's what I'm going for. That's what I'm going for with everything I'm doing. The books I write, this podcast I make, the ministry I'm doing down here in Peru. It didn't talk about it that much on this podcast, but I encourage you to subscribe, check us out. There's plenty of archived discussions before today's show that I encourage you to go back and listen to. Like I said, we seek to kick people out of the upper room, and maybe today the way I could rephrase that is, push you out of your comfort zone and get going for it. Like, do you feel like you need to write? Well, what can I do to help you? Do you want to get podcasting? What can I do to help you? How can I encourage you? How can I be praying for you? Just do whatever. Let me know. Contact me. I'm on Facebook. I'm on, I've got my email address out there. I don't want to give out on the podcast, but it's easy to get if you go looking for it. Please, no spammers. And thank you for listening today. And this is fire on your head. Get out of the upper room. There's like a few weeks ago, our guest said, there's a time for soaking, in the upper room, but there's also time to get out, go reach the world around you. And I know many of you listening to this particular discussion, that's with the written word. And thank you for listening. God bless you.
We hope you enjoyed today's show. If you'd like to subscribe to the podcast, you can find us in iTunes or on Stitcher Radio, or directly at fireonyourhead.com for more options. If you want to support Steve and Lily Bremner as missionaries in Peru, or find out more about what they do, be sure to head over to their blog at stevebremner.com, or check out Steve's Kindle books on Amazon and leave reviews of the ones you liked. See you next time.